the first major topic we're going to be talking about is how do we break down the barriers of cross-functional collaboration. Now, some of these challenges are going to seem familiar to you, which is not great, but also great, because I'm going to give you some tips on how to start addressing them. So we can have a misalignment of goals and priorities. And this of course happens like between people, right? So you can have it like just between people within the same department, and very common. But what happens when you want to involve people from different departments, sales and marketing, finance? How do you make sure that they have aligned goals and priorities, right? So this is one of these like silent killers that you wonder, why are people not using it? Why is it not being adopted? And no one's going to come and tell you, oh, we've got, misaligned goals between our departments, right? It's not going to happen, right? Yet this is one of those things in the background that if you were able to take the time and understand what their goals are and what their priorities are, you would be able to figure out, okay, well, here is a challenge, right, that we have to try and overcome. And so this is one of these silent killers that is important to highlight, right, because we often miss it. I'm going to talk about how you can address that soon. But first, let me go through another challenge. So we can have communication gaps. I'm going to move my head out of the way there so you can see that one. Okay, so you're all familiar with, obviously, there's a gap between IT and the business. There's a gap between analytics, data, BI, and the business. And we have to try and bridge that gap. So not only do we have gaps with just people's ability to communicate to each other as normal humans, we have that multiplied with when we start introducing technical jargon, technical terms, and then working with data. It's partially a data literacy challenge, we'll talk about later, but it's also basic human communication that gets exacerbated by use of technical terms. And finally, of course, there's many challenges related to like that barriers we have in cross-functional collaboration, but insufficient process and tools. I'm not a big fan of introducing lots and lots of different tools, but I will say that is more related to let's not introduce 10 BI technologies, because one does self-service, one has a very nice user experience, right? They're not good enough reasons. But there are reasons to introduce tools for enabling collaboration. And let me give an example of that. So like Miro, Mural, Figma, of course, like Teams and Slack, right? Different technologies that enable and support communication, particularly of remote teams. So that's important, but also processes. So if we think of how we can collaborate and work together in the context of analytics, so what is that and what does it look like? One thing that I like to consider is, if you do end up having a proliferation of tools and technologies, using something like an analytics hub, right? So something that can bring all these things together in one place into one user experience. So these are our challenges. So now I'm going to just give you some tips, tactics at a high level of how to be able to address these. Now, this isn't a one-for-one. So when you see a tip, it doesn't mean it's related exactly to the one to its left. So that's going to make sense in a second, right? But we need to establish a shared vision and clear set of objectives. And consider this on a dashboard level, like a tactical dashboard level. What do you need to do to make sure you have alignment across your teams, across their goals? And one way to do that is to just have a discrete step in your process where you're going to talk about that. When I started in this space some years ago, consulting, one of the main things I ended up doing was just getting people in a room in a workshop. And that wasn't my idea. I did not like to work with people, particularly particularly having to deal with friction and misalignment between teams in a workshop setting, a workshop environment. So it's not something I want to do, but it's something I was thrown into. But there was a framework and structure there to kind of facilitate a conversation between people. You need to do this up front. It's like one of the first things you have to do when you're building any kind of dashboard, especially one that you want to drive value on. Sure, if you want to sit in there and gathering dust, you don't need to do this step, but this is a critical first step, is make sure that we're aligned and that we have common set of goals and common set of expectations. So, for example, let's say we're building a sales dashboard, but it was also to be used by marketing and finance. So some of the challenges we're going to have there is, well, marketing is going to want to attribute a lot of the sales performance to the marketing effort, and sales isn't going to want to do that, right? So we have to get alignment there. Okay, well, how are we going to measure sales and how are we going to measure attribution? If finance is in the room, they're going to look at sales in a different way and revenue in a different way to both of those teams. So we have to have a consistency of, okay, well, how are we going to measure that? And is it fair to measure them in the same ways? It might be that it's not. It might be that there's a sales department sales figure. It might be there's a marketing department sales figure. And it might be there's a finance sales figure. But we won't know that until we get people in the room and decide what's our shared vision and shared set of objectives. So next tip I have to address these challenges on the left is to improve communication through shared visual language. So we can obviously try and talk the same language, in this case English, right? Whatever the natural language is, the native language. But that's not enough. What if we have very technical people? So let's just take an example of like a fairly technical role. Let's say a data scientist. And they'll talk about models and let's say marketing attribution models. And that's what they love and they're passionate about it, and that's great. But then you have a business person, and let's say an example of someone who might be non-technical might be someone working in marketing who's very focused on, emotion, right? Like driving people's emotion, getting them to buy things. Very different mindset to a data scientist. So how do we get them communicating together? My major tip on this is use a visual language. How I used to do this in the past, sticky notes, in a workshop, sketched wireframes, keep things as low tech as possible, and basically show the vision of what it's going to look like. And people can rally around that. Now, of course, you can still have technical conversations, technical terms being introduced, right? But we want to try and focus more on the visual language, right? And the visualization. People can understand it and get behind it and feel like they have a stake at the table. They are able to give their inputs onto it. So it's something that I found when I was doing workshops. Initially, I'd started using, everything was digital, right? So even though it was in a workshop, people were there physically present, long before COVID, of course. My temptation was to use these big touch screens, right? And use digital sticky notes. And it was kind of like missing the point of the low-tech experience. And what I found was some people enjoyed that, but also some were just sort of disengaged. When I started using just sticky notes and just, the sketching charts on the whiteboard, everyone was involved and everyone was more engaged. Sure, some people wanted it more technical, but they still were there and they still had a seat at the table. And the non-technical people were like, hey, this is just like sticky notes and sketches on a board. Like I don't have to learn all about data and to be involved, So it was an important step for us to be able to just figure out, okay, how can we get people together? So common visual language. And for me, then obviously I ended up formalizing that in the dashboard wireframe kit, just a way for us to be able to do that quickly without me having to sketch everything up every single time. Take the conversation away from, hey, what tool are we building? Getting into technical terms. Just focus on the questions we're trying to ask. What's that going to look like when I see it? And what action is it going to drive? Next one. Implement effective collaboration tools and processes. I talked about this a tiny bit with the process and tools. A process example would be, of course, like the enterprise dashboard process. If you haven't checked it out, you can check my blog. I have a blog on a process that you can use. All the details are there to effectively run an entire dashboard project end to end and then iterate on it. What you need is a process that is going to enable technical teams to engage with non-technical people. Without that kind of process, the technical teams are going to do what they know, which is completely natural and understandable. They're going to build. right? And they're going to focus on the things that are important to them. So if you're a data professional, you're probably going to focus on surfacing more data and insights to the organization. But if those data and insights are not aligned to the people, they're not designed for them, they don't have a persona basis behind them, and they're not aligned to the goals, then it's going to be very hard to build something that is ultimately going to get adopted long term. So we want to use a process. I recommend the enterprise dashboard process, and then different tools and different technologies. So tools, I like to keep things as lightweight as possible, as tactile as possible. But in terms of tools, if you're thinking, right, a common example is there's lots of different dashboards and reports in your organization. You don't want to have to go redesigning absolutely everything. There's probably value in some of them out there. You could use a tool like an analytics hub. And that's something that basically brings all your dashboards and reports just into one place. So it's like a single place you can go to find everything. So